Hello, Merry Christmas 2025. Welcome to Get Your Fix, where we celebrate the works of legendary children's author Philippe Fix. I'm your host, Dan Hutt, and today we reach back to 1968 and we look at Beebo and the Fizzimen, or as I like to think of it, Seraphin Part 2. In the old days, Seraphin went by different names. Early on, in English, Beebo, and in other languages, different names as well. In Swedish, Hubert, for instance. But I prefer Seraphin. So in our reading today, every time it says Beebo, I'll go with Seraphin. And we'll also hold true to Plume and Hercules as well. From Philippe Fix, Beebo and the Fizzimen, or Seraphin Part 2. You remember Seraphin and Plume when we last saw them were climbing up into the sky on their stairs, and now they're coming down. Once upon a time there was fizzy lemonade. And once upon a time there were a great many big businessmen who wanted to sell millions and millions of bottles of fizzy lemonade. So they decided to make a film advertising it. And that is where this story begins. The managing director of the Fizzy Lemonade Company was in a terrible temper when he went down to the film studio to see how the filmmakers were getting on. He spread his arms out wide, opened his large mouth, and shouted at them. "What's all this about Fizzy going to the moon?" he yelled. "Who wants to see a lot of moon men drinking Fizzy? That won't sell any bottles. You're wasting your time." The film producer and the advertising manager trembled before him. "But sir," they said, "you haven't seen the film yet. It's not quite ready. If you would just be patient." "I've seen enough," cried the angry managing director. "Your ideas are old-fashioned. The moon is old-fashioned. You're old-fashioned." We could make a commercial showing a hippopotamus drinking Fizzy in Africa," said the film producer. "That would be different than the moon idea, anyway." "What have hippopotami have got to do with your Fizzy?" yelled the managing director, who was now purple in the face. "Tell me." Nobody in the studio could tell him. But then, as he turned away, his sharp eyes were suddenly attracted to an extraordinary sight. It was so very extraordinary that the managing director rushed over to the window to obtain a closer view. "Take his picture," he shouted. "What is it?" asked the film producer as he obeyed. As a matter of fact, it was Seraphin. Ever since Seraphin and his friend Plume had escaped from the heartless men who were destroying their lovely house, Seraphin and Plume had been floating about in the sky on sections of their magic staircase. But you can't float forever, and Seraphin, with his friend close behind him, was actually floating past the film studio's windows on his way to land. Plume landed first, just outside the big station, and almost at once they got a job cleaning one of the giant engines. It didn't work out too well for Seraphin and Plume when Plume turned the hose on him by mistake. Plume, with his little companion Hercules the hamster, tucked well inside his pullover, certainly enjoying the work. "Cheer up, Seraphin," said Plume. "If we work hard enough, we'll earn the money we need to buy something at the station buffet. I'm absolutely ravenous. I could eat a horse." "So could I," said Seraphin, after he had wiped the water out of his eyes. "We'll buy sausage rolls and lemonade and eat them on one of the sidings." And that is what they did. Then they asked the station manager for more work, But the station master shook his head. "Sorry," he said. "I'm afraid all the engines have been washed and polished already. The only one left was the one you have just done." "Let's have some more sausage rolls, then," said Seraphin as they sat down and began eating all over again. Suddenly Plume pointed. "Look, Seraphin," he cried. "Look over there at that old engine. Isn't she lovely, even though she's falling to bits? They've shunted her into a siding and forgotten all about her, I bet." Seraphin stared. "Magnificent," he said. She was an old steam locomotive. Falling to bits, but she had once been something of an aristocrat, Seraphin could tell. "She needs cleaning," Plume decided, his eyes shining. "They might let us do it." "We'll ask at the office," Seraphin said. They went to the seat to see the station master again, but he shook his head and said, "Only the engines still in service are allowed to be washed. That one isn't used anymore. She's really had her day." "Could we do another job?" asked Plume. "Sorry again," said the station master, "but there's no more work today. All the jobs around the station are done." Seraphin and Plume didn't really mind this. They walked admiringly around the poor old neglected engine, which stood close to a park where children were playing. Seraphin looked at the engine, then at the children. "I have an idea." Seraphin took his idea to Plume as they hurried back to the station master. The official wasn't surprised. "But it doesn't even go," he objected. "Doesn't matter," Seraphin said calmly. "It's already at the edge of the park, which is just where we want it." The station master was a kind-hearted man. "I'm not allowed to sell it or hire it," he said, "but there's no rule to stop me lending it to you." Overjoyed, Seraphin and Plume sped back to the old engine and started on their plan. Though they met with difficulties, such as Seraphin pulling an alarm by mistake and making Plume fall into the chimney, they worked so hard that everything was ready by late afternoon. Then, to an audience from the park, they triumphantly opened their puppet theater. That night they slept in a small hotel, and then they went back to the park. No one was there. "Never mind," said Seraphin. "The children will be back later. This morning I'd like to buy material to make more puppets." When they were out in the street, they noticed children staring at them. "I say," muttered Seraphin proudly, "they must be yesterday's audience." "I didn't realize there were so many watching," said Plume. A crowd was gathering around them. Some of them ran up to Seraphin to beg him for his autograph. Plume began to feel uneasy, for now a number of grown-ups were behaving strangely. Some came forward and shook Seraphin's hand warmly. Some were taking photographs, and one woman congratulated him, saying, "I saw you on television. I heard you on the radio, and I've seen your picture in the papers. You're wonderful." "They think I'm someone else," thought Seraphin, and said aloud, "You must be mistaking me for someone else." At this the crowd of onlookers laughed. By the time Seraphin had shaken 738 people by the hand, signed his name 1,134 times, and promised to hand out 1,822 bottles of something whose name he did not know, he felt he had to get away. He grabbed Plume's arm, and together they ran until they had shaken off their pursuers. Seraphin was breathless, but he told Plume, "Wait for me here. I'm going to buy a newspaper. Perhaps it will tell us what this is all about." As Plume waited, he saw something that made his eyes nearly pop out of his head. Two Seraphins walking down the road. "I'm seeing things," he thought, and closed his eyes. But when he looked again, the two Seraphins had gone. When Seraphin returned, Plume said, "You'll never guess what I've seen." "Are you talking to me?" Seraphin said crossly. Don't you say excuse me when you speak to strangers? But Seraphin, I'm your friend, Plume. Don't be cheeky, I've never met you before in my life. This upset Plume, who said angrily, Fame is giving you a swollen head. You've gone too far, said Seraphin. He took a bottle from his pocket and cracked Plume over the head with it. Then he ran off. Suddenly Seraphin joined him again. Come on, there's a newsagent fairly close. Plume followed in bewilderment. No sooner were they back in the main street than they were rooted to the spot by an extraordinary sight. Plume started counting. 1, 2, 3, 5, 11, 15. There were 15 Seraphins in front of them. Some were flesh and blood, and the rest were advertisements. Posters, neon, huge moving models, and all of them bore the same slogan: Fizzy is the lightest. Seraphin was the lightest too. He was faint with astonishment. After the first shock, the two friends went back to their room. It's simple, said Mop. The fizzy people. It's simple, said Plume. The fizzy people photographed you when you were floating past on magic steps, and they've begun a huge publicity campaign with you as the center. Scandalous, said Seraphin. He was furious. Surely no one can use my photo without asking me. Plume thought that the tasty lunch might help Seraphin feel better, but even the bags of food he had bought had Seraphin's picture on them. It was the last straw when an opener for a sardine tin was Seraphin shaped. Poor Seraphin was in despair. I'm just not going to move out of this room, he declared. I can't bear those dreadful advertisements. At that very moment, they heard a knock. Plume opened the door. One of Seraphin's doubles held out a case of bottles and said, You'll feel the lightest if you drink. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize you were one of us. Something had to be done quickly. Seraphin set off for the Fizzy offices to try to stop them using his photograph, but when he arrived, he found nearly 30 other Seraphins waiting to see the director. The director's secretary thought that Seraphin was just another traveling salesman. You'll have to wait your turn, she said firmly. But when, 2 hours later, it was time for his interview, he was told that the director had just left. Come back tomorrow, said the secretary. Plume was waiting outside. Let's get on with our puppet show, said Seraphin, too disgusted to say too much about what had happened. They wanted to catch a bus to the park, but the director would not let them on. You're not going to sell Fizzy on this bus, he cried. And when they went into a shop, the shopkeeper refused to serve them. We're flooded with Fizzy, he shouted at them. But the worst was yet to come. Just as the puppet show was about to start, the mothers caught sight of Seraphin. They pulled their children away from the old train, saying most indignantly, No more publicity for Fizzy. This is too much. The two friends were feeling very cast down when Plume had an idea. You must disguise yourself, he said, so that you don't look like you. So Seraphin put on a wig and mustache and a beard which turned him into a silver-haired old man. Imagine his feelings when he and Plume went for a walk down the town a little later and discovered that all the advertisements had been changed and now showed him as a silver-haired old man. The slogans had also been altered to "Make old age happy with Fizzy." Seraphin was so angry that he quite lost his temper. He caught sight of a man wearing sandwich boards that advertised Fizzy and Fizzy souvenirs. He grabbed hold of the man's false beard and his tray of fizzy dolls, only and he jumped up and down on them until the dolls were broken to bits. Only then did he notice a little girl who was crying her heart out. "She's terribly upset," explained Plume. "She was just about to buy a fizzy doll when you came along and broke them all." "Oh, I'm sorry," Seraphin apologized. "Let me buy you some sweets." "I don't want any sweets. I want a doll that looks like you." "Come along then," said Seraphin in a kind voice. He put his arm around her shoulders and led her to a shop. "Come inside and we'll buy you another doll." And with his last few coins, he bought the little girl the doll she wanted so much, an old man Seraphin doll. That night, Seraphin slept badly. Excuse me. Twice. 3 times. Excuse me. That night, Seraphin slept badly. He had a dreadful nightmare in which a many-faced plume was blowing bubbles that all looked like Seraphin. Some people say that sleeping on your worries helps you solve them. But when Seraphin woke the next morning, he had no idea what to do next. He sat down on the floor looking very miserable. "Don't give up hope," said Plume. "It will all work itself out. We just have to be patient." But Seraphin had run out of patience. "This business has upset my whole life," he complained. "I can't go anywhere. I can't do anything. Bus conductors and shopkeepers won't have anything to do with me, and even our puppet theater has been ruined." Plume couldn't bear to hear his friend so down in the dumps. "Hercules and I will make you smile," he said, and without another word he and the hamster began a peculiar dance. They looked so funny that Seraphin's gloomy expression went away, and he could not stop himself bursting into loud laughter. "Grrr, grrr," growled Plume, leaping about on the rug. "Now I'm a dragon, devouring and destroying everything in my path." "Plume," Seraphin exclaimed, "you've just given me an idea. Remember the dragon we once made out of old scrap metal in our first adventure? Well, I think I know how to take our revenge on the fizzy monster." "How?" asked Plume, his eyes wide open with eagerness. Seraphin drew some quick sketches on large pieces of paper. Then he said, "We'll build a machine that devours and destroys everything in its path." Seraphin and Plume cleaned 2 more railway engines to have enough money to buy what they needed from the scrap dealers. It did not take Seraphin long at all to sit down and design this new contraption. When he had done so, the two friends found a bit of waste ground and commenced building. "You get busy making the paint squirters," Seraphin ordered, "while I fix a motor." "Can I make some cannons to fire soot?" asked Plume wistfully. "Good idea." By dawn, the machine was ready. By 9 o'clock, they had put the finishing touch to their plans. At noon, they went into action. The town still wonders what hit it. Everyone who saw the machine suffered from bad dreams for weeks afterwards. People were speechless. After it was all over, when they tried to describe what they had seen, They could still not find words. They only knew that when the machine left town with its two occupants, all the fizzy advertisements seemed to have disappeared. They had been replaced by pretty blobs of paint and looked just like what artists call abstract paintings. Every street had been turned into an open air art gallery. Plume and Seraphin never found out exactly how far they traveled in their machine or how far they walked when it ran out of fuel. They only knew when they saw the old mill that this was the place they had to stop. The mill was a strong stone building with a motionless mill wheel. How peaceful it looked, thought Seraphin. It was like a friendly giant asleep in the sun. If we stayed here, he said to Plume, no one would ever know us, and we could be happy again. They visited the mayor of the village, who gave them permission to stay for a while. The mill has been empty for years, he said, so you're welcome to the place. The mayor's goodness reminded Seraphin of the station master, the kind station master in the old engine. There are still some decent folk left in the world, he remarked to Plume. The friends led a quiet and happy life in the village, which had no television, radio, or newspapers to bring tidings of the world outside. With Mop's willing help, with Plume's willing help, Seraphin began to plan how to make the mill a comfortable, homely place to live in, and how to start it working again. Seraphin's first job was to repair the mill wheel. After a few days, he called Plume. I think I've done it. And as they stood up and watched, the whole mill seemed to come alive. The walls shook, the wooden rafts groaned, and then slowly at first, the old mill wheel began to turn. Plume tried to catch some trout by directing the channel of water into his basket. One day it was not the trout, but Plume who slid through the gate. He would have had a bad fall had his pullover not gotten caught. The villagers came to admire the result of Plume and Seraphin's hard work. Fancy that, they all said. You have done a great job. I've got a sack of grain waiting to be ground, said one man. Let's try out your mill and see if it's any good. Beebo set the machinery going, and the grains of corn came out as fine white flour. It was so excellent that all the villagers wanted the two friends to grind their corn. They were very pleased to do so. It helped the villagers, and Seraphin and Plume did not have to pay rent for the mill. Beebo, Seraphin, shouted Plume one Sunday morning, come and see what I've found. It was an old oven, still smelling of wood smoke. Seraphin had a look at the fireplace and then turned to Plume. We've an oven, wood, flour, so we can make some bread, finished Plume. He was so keen that he tried to lift the sack too heavy for him. The flour spilled, and Plume was a snowman. Their first batch of loaves did not turn out too well. Their second was better, and their third was delicious. The smell of fresh bread, the comfort of the mill, and the peace of the countryside made the two friends feel as if they could live there forever. But trouble was on the way. One Sunday a red car stopped near the mill. Seraphin and Plume sped out of sight while the mayor was talking to the visitors. Wealthy businessman, tired, needs rest, quiet spot were phrases they overheard. Then the car drove away. The bread that day was not as tasty as usual. A long way away, The director of Fizzy Lemonade paced fiercely about his office. "Look at that graph," he stormed at his sales staff. "Hardly a bottle of fizzy sold for weeks and weeks." Then he collapsed into his chair. "But, sir," said one of the salesmen, "you know how the newspapers made fun of us after our advertising campaign was ruined." "Idiot," shouted the director, "of course I know. But what I want to know now is what you fools mean to do about it. Today's papers are worse than ever. Have you seen what they say? What happened to the fizzy man? Was he so puffed up that he has floated away altogether? And here, buy fizzy and be windy. We've got to get more posters stuck up everywhere." A salesman cried, "But sir, we've run out of posters." "Take some more photographs of the fizzy man. Print thousands of them." "But sir, the man who came out of the sky, the model, has vanished." "Find him, find him. Search the whole country if necessary." The room fell silent. For a few minutes nobody dared to speak. Then a voice murmured, "I have here some photographs of your new country house." The director nearly exploded. "This is not the moment to talk about my new country house," he said shrilly. "There are more important matters. Just the same, if you would take a look. See here by the millstone." The director looked and fell into a good humor immediately. What had happened was that the director's assistant, who had been looking for a holiday home for his superior, had accidentally stumbled on Seraphin and Plume's hiding place. He had taken photos that showed them clearly. At once the director decided to launch a new campaign around Seraphin. That same night, Seraphin and Plume, who fortunately had Hercules sleeping in his pullover, were taken by surprise as they slept. They were kidnapped and dragged off to the Fizzy Lemonade offices, where they were placed under close guard. Escape seemed impossible. Seraphin overheard the guards talking about Fizzy's new publicity stunt. It would be held in the main city square. At the director's signal, Seraphin would step out of a trunk on the platform. His appearance would prove that Mr. Fizzy had not vanished into thin air. The sales of Fizzy would rise. But Seraphin made his own plans. Luckily, their prison was also a storeroom. "If they want me, they'll have me," he said grimly to Plume. The director came and explained to the friends what had to be done. He did not notice anything unusual. The publicity stunt looked as if it was going to be everything that the director hoped for. There was a big brass band, there was a press conference, there were film and television cameramen. The affair seemed perfect. When the moment that the crowd had been waiting for arrived, the director, dressed in a magician's suit, stepped onto the platform. The audience was hushed. "My friends," he said, "there has been a rumor that Mr. Fizzy refuses to have anything to do with Fizzy and is gone. This is a lie. In a moment he will appear." He tapped the trunk with his wand, but it was not Seraphin who rose up. Instead, it was a balloon twin that Seraphin had made. It was so lifelike that everyone clapped. But soon eyes widened in astonishment. Inside the trunk, Plume and Seraphin were busy with an air pump. The dummy grew bigger and bigger and bigger. No one could mistake it for the real Seraphin. The director and his friends were afraid, and rightly so. Suddenly it burst. Bang! The dummy collapsed, and out of it a huge white balloon soared into the sky, carrying Seraphin and Plume and Hercules off to new wonderful adventures.